Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So today I am doing the first of hopefully many videos on world building. World building is something that I feel like I'm a bit of a beginner at. It's definitely not my area of expertise. I still wanted to share insights that I might have as I become more experienced with world building. I have been working on two fantasy projects. One is a personal project that I've actually been working on for for years. And then another one, which I'm just in the planning stages on right now. So in this video, I'm going to be running through kind of my world building mindset or philosophy that I think is kind of just like world building 101, the general method that I use to try and create intricate and cohesive world building that I hope will be helpful if you too maybe feel slightly overwhelmed by world building and you don't really know how to start stringing all these pieces together. In this video, what I'm not going to be doing is going through different areas of world building. You know, architecture, geography, government, history. I think you can go so deep into world building, just deep diving into one specific topic. For a resource that I recommend on that, I've recently been listening to the podcast World Building for Masochists, and in each episode they go through a specific area of world building and just talk about different ways that you could think about it. So the way that I like to think of world building is that it kind of is like a multi-axial thing. You can world build out, which is expanding the number of data points you have in your world and connecting various data points. And then you can also world build up, which is expanding on the level of detail within a specific data point. Or you could also world build down, which I think is kind of like the opposite of world building up. So it's kind of adding almost the shadow beneath your data points. So things like mysteries, secrets, lore. So you kind of have a chart where the y-axis is the depth of the world building and the x-axis is the breadth of the world building. So that leads to what I think is a really common world building error: focusing too much on the breadth and not focusing enough on the depth. Putting too much effort into creating a vast world before you're creating a deep world or an intricate world. I personally think that deep world building is better than vast world building. It's great if you can do vast world building if that's your goal. I'm not saying that vast world building is bad. A lot of the time that can be excellent, but I think that vast world building is only going to be as effective as it is also deep. I think doing vast world building where you have a very large world with many different data points, but there isn't enough time put into the specific data points themselves, I think that that's when a world can feel thin and underdeveloped. Whereas I think a world with fewer data points, but there's a lot of time put into the depth of those data points, will feel much richer. So let's say that you create a whole world with 7 different realms, but there isn't really any work put into the actual details of these different places, versus a world that would have very little vastness but a lot of depth would be maybe a specific city, but that specific city has very rich intricacy put into its inner working. You can definitely have both, but I do think a mistake is to think that vast world building is complex world building, when I actually think complex world building is deep world building, and I think that should be the priority before making it vast. If we're thinking of setting as character, you could even view characters this way with this same type of axis. You know, there's filling out their life, but then there's giving it meaning, and there's also giving it subtext. Personally, when I'm world building, I like to begin from what I call my world's defining features. So this is something in the world that is both significant, but also different from our world. So what I like to do is begin with these defining features and work out from those features. And I think by doing that, you can kind of weave together the impact of the defining features throughout your world. Because I think that that really is what creates the most interesting world building, is when the things within the world that are unique to it, we can see their ripple effects in interesting ways throughout many different aspects of the world. If you're going to add magic, there's no thought put into how that magic would affect education and healthcare and government and all these other things, down to very little intricacies, then I don't think it feels like a very well thought out world. Introduce one thing that's different and the ripple effects are going to ripple throughout so many different areas of your world. I personally like to start from the defining features and kind of begin building my world outwards, thinking about the impact of those defining features on the different areas of my world. So examples of defining features, I think a really clear example from Shadow and Bone, I would say kind of 2 defining features to the world from Shadow and Bone: the fold and the magic system. If you have a magic system, it's probably a defining feature. We normally will think of the defining features as like the magical elements that are within the world, but they don't necessarily have to be magical. You could have like a cultural defining feature or even like a geographic defining feature. The whole reason why I like to world build this way, where I begin by identifying the defining features of my world and then I build out from there, is because I think it is the easiest way to just keep in mind how those kind of like touchstone qualities of your world that make it unique are going to like ripple through all aspects of your world. I think world building can feel very thin when you introduce major disruptive element to it, like something that doesn't exist in our world but would be very significant. And then a bunch of the stuff around it from like a cultural perspective is kind of just like the same as in our world or whatever historical time period or place the story is based on, right? And personally, I think that one common mistake with world building is putting the focus so much on creating a world that is as vast as our world when like all levels with you. That is impossible. Do you know how complex our world is? I'm just gonna Google right now how many articles are on Wikipedia, because I think that this is a pretty good ballpark for how many things there are. Almost 7 billion. In order to create a world that is as complex as our world, you would need to create 7 billion different things. That is not possible, and I think it's not needed either. What I do think makes a world feel complex and lived in is when there are intricate little connections between things that make sense. Like, it's quality over quantity, right? Instead of introducing a million things in your world but not really thinking about how they tie together and how they affect each other, purposely adding elements to your world that tie together and have these little intricate connections you can explore. And some of them may be very, very small, right? And some of them may be very, very... I mean, obviously you are probably going to need to generate quite a lot of things, material, items, places, events, whatever. But I think that the most important thing is creating them purposefully in a way where they have compelling little intersections in the scope of your story. How can you create these compelling, nuanced little connections which also apply such a larger world beyond your world? I think that the ability to have little connections within what is shown in your world is what creates the sense those connections veer off the border of the page in the story, right? So I'm going to jump into an example now where I walk through some of my own world building to kind of show you what this looks like. So welcome to the live example portion of the video. First of all, like, there are so many facets of world building you can cover. The point of this example isn't to go through every single facet of world building. Like, it's just to show like kind of method, but I'm definitely not going to run through every single facet of world building or even get close to it in just like a short example. I also want to be clear that I don't actually world build by mind mapping like this. This is just a visual representation of what my mental process looks like, but you could mind map like this if you want. I'm using Scapple to do this. For this example, I'm going to be using my personal fantasy project, Where We Seek Dawn. I've been working on this for like 7 years, so I'm obviously not going to show all of the detail or all of the world building. I'm kind of just trying to recreate the process as if I were just starting. Like, let's imagine that I just got this idea. How would I get started? This is 45 minutes of world building that I've been doing for 7 years. This example is to show the process, not to show like perfectly airtight logical world building. So like I said, I like to start world building from my defining features. So I have 2 defining features in this world, and I consider these the defining features because to me, these are like large disruptions in the world. There are so many different philosophies around world building. You know, when I see fantasy where there are large disruptive elements to the world, but then the world is very similar to like a real historical Earth, time and place, I'm like, but why would that happen? You know, like, there's such a ripple effect to history and human society. You change one thing and it can have such a ripple effect. Like, when you introduce something huge, like for example magic, I think that logically that will have a massive effect on how society develops and will probably lead to something that is quite different from what we have on Earth. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong or that you can't, you know, introduce magic in a, you know, more historical based fantasy. That's fine. But that's just to say that personally within my own work, I really enjoy world building in a way where I start from my defining features and really try to parse all the different ways that that defining feature would affect the development of the society in my world in order to create a society that hopefully feels unique, and also it feels like the defining feature is actually woven through the world in a way that makes sense, and you can see the presence of that defining feature even in small details. So I'm going to get started by just listing my 3 types of magic. So the first type of magic that I have is called equating. It's the ability to manipulate a person's life forces with a compass-like device. Anyone can learn this, but it requires an equipass, which is the name of the device in Zanja, and an Elysium, which is the name of the device in Jinsari. We have 2 places in the world. Let's just note down the realms of this world as kind of just like a side note so we can kind of keep track. I can pop up a map if you want to see what that all looks like. The second type of magic is called light walking. This is the ability to bend light around yourself in order to appear invisible. This is an innate ability mostly found in Jinsari and Southern Ashar. And then we have our third magical ability, which is called spirit bending. This is the ability to channel heat. This is an innate ability mostly found in Apithuk and Northern Valhalla. And then we have 2 of these miniature suns in my world. This is a very important feature in my world. They're called so-suns. That's because it's like a linguistic thing. So is the Zon word for 2. So it's like the second sun. The main sun is called the A sun because A is like Zon in the Zon language. That means 1. So that's where that name comes from. So these are kind of like these major disruptive features that we're working with. We have these 2 miniature suns, one of which orbits around Zanja, which is like a whole nation that it takes up this entire island. And then the other one is hidden in a cave in Jinsari. It's only known to Jin people. No one else knows about it. It's like their best kept secret. And then we have 3 types of magic. The way that I would kind of start thinking from here is I would kind of just start asking myself, how do things connect and how is it going to affect different aspects of the world, right? So if we want to do something really basic, we can ask ourselves, okay, we have a society where there's a miniature sun. This means people will have to adapt to a climate that is extremely hot and where it is never actually night. So what is that going to mean? See it in the calendar system. The days of the week in Zanja are marked or like named by the Sosun's weekly orbit. So the day the Sosun passes over the capital city, which is called Seoul. I know, I called the city with a miniature sun the Latin word for sun. That was something that I just did as a placeholder and then never changed. Be more creative than me. But it's a personal project and it stuck, so I never bothered changing it. It's called Ensun. And then, you know, the day where it's farthest is called Farsun. The evening of Farsun, that's the day where it's the furthest from the city, is the busiest time of the week because it's the coolest. And so that's kind of when you're gonna have like weekly markets and parties and music and stuff because it's the coolest period of the week. There's also like a version of time zones. The days are shifted in different cities. So in a city that's north of Seoul called Razin, and sun is 1 day later because that's when the Sosun passes over that city. And so the entire weekly calendar is shifted 1 day. Think about like architecture, right? So people have to adapt to a very hot climate and where it's never actually night. So sleeping quarters, people usually build underground. The city is built in such a way that there are city walls that kind of provide shade and also channel breeze off the ocean. And that was taking inspiration from a real place. There's an island in Croatia called Korčula where the sea walls are built in such a way that they channel the breeze off the ocean, which I thought was like very ingenious. And the city is naturally air conditioned. And I was like, okay, this is an extremely hot seaside city, so it makes sense that they would have something like that. And you can also think about things like clothing. Suns, which I'll get to in a second when we talk about religion, are seen as a holy object, and so they're frequently used as a motif in people's jewelry and clothing. There's a very common piece of jewelry in the Zon culture called a sun disc, which is like a metal disc shaped like a sun that you like wear on your forehead. Clothing is going to be pretty conservative because you have to cover most of your skin or you will burn. So those are just like a couple practical things. And again, you could go more into it, but those are just some general practical things. We could get into food. We can get into a ton of stuff. Those are just some kind of, I think, logical questions to ask. Like, okay, you have an extremely hot city where it's never really night. Like, the closest you get to night is on Farsun. It looks like dusk, basically, but you never actually get night. I mean, there are tons of superstitions around night in Zanja. People hate night. That's an unholy time because for them the sun is a very holy object, and so being away from its protection, like, that is evil. They don't like it. And one thing that I always find really interesting is religion. That's something that I like to put a lot of thought into just because it's an aspect of world building I find interesting. In this religion, Equa is the kind of their like goddess creator, and the Sosun is her body. So it's considered like the body of their god. Another really important feature of this world is this a defining feature of the Sun Daughters? Are they a defining feature? I'll mark them as a defining feature. They're like an adjacent defining feature. They're the daughters of Equa, so they're basically like, I guess you could call them demigods, protectors of the Sosun. They emerge from the Sosun. It's theorized that that's kind of where they're born on this like divine plane. Real soul duty is to protect it. That's why they come to the mortal plane, is just to protect it. And we can start getting into kind of like answering some questions. So like one question that you might have is, why are the Sosuns in these two places? Well, it's because it's the only place that they could be put without kind of destroying the climate. Ashar, which I'm not really talking about in this video because it's not really that relevant to my defining features, kind of the most like arable land in the world, and so they didn't want to destroy it, and so they couldn't put a Sosun near there. However, the thing about the Sun Daughters is like they're gods, right? They're not people. They have essentially like a god-like idea of morality. They don't really understand how people work. They give the people of the world all the resources they need, and then they're shocked when people start like going to war and like invading each other over resources. You know, they're kind of like, wait a second, who had invent nationhood on their what will the people do bingo card? Because I did not see that coming. They didn't expect people to create nations because they're from a divine plane of a singular divine society where all their needs are inherently met. Another question that I ask when I look at this is, okay, I have 3 magical abilities. 1, that anyone can learn as long as they have the device that allows you to do it, and 2, that they seem to be genetic. So why? Why are these abilities only found in certain populations? The reason these abilities are found in only certain regions is because they are people who are descended from Sun Daughters. One of the Zon Sun Daughters left her post. She went to Northern Vilha. She had children, and that's why spirit bending is almost entirely contained within the Apathic gene pool, which is a like ethnic group in this book. One of the Jin Sun Daughters had children, and so that ability is a little more widespread. It's not like really just contained within one ethnic group, but it's primarily focused in Southern Ashar and in Jinsari. Let's talk about equating, actually, because honestly, equating is really where this all came from. Like this whole book, I really built it around equating. So one question I always ask myself when it comes to magic is education. How does one learn equating? In Zandra, wealthy children are taught by private tutors. Equipasses, which is the device you need to do this, it kind of looks like a compass, are expensive. So class barriers prevent many from learning magic, but lots are sold on the black market or inherited through families. 2 cultures in this world with essentially the same defining features. They both have Sosun and they both have the same type of magic, but they're quite different. There's not just one way to evolve a defining feature. If there was only just one logical way of being, then all cultures and all people would think the same, but that's not true. Humans are incredibly diverse in beliefs and practices in just every possible way. And so here we have 2 of the same defining features that have evolved into 2 extremely different cultures. In Jinsari, children have a coming of age ceremony around the age of 12 or 13, where they're kind of admitted into like the oneness of Jin society. They're given an Elysium, which is their equivalent to an Equipass, by a parent who makes it and who teaches them to use it. And so magic is seen very differently there because it's much more accessible to the general population. In Jinsari, pretty much it's a very small population. Geography of it's extremely easy to defend, and so as a result the Jin culture is very ancient. Like it's essentially untampered with. No one has ever colonized Jinsari. No one has ever invaded Jinsari. It is the same culture that has kind of existed from the dawn of Jinsari. And so as a result, people there are very protective of their lands, of their ways of life. I mean, who's not protective of their ancestral lands? Everyone. But they don't really have outside cultural influences, and they're like, we keep it that way. It's not like in Zandra where there's much more extreme like class division, and so magic becomes more of a point of conflict, I think, between people, whereas in Jinsari it's more of a point of unification. You know, we all learn this and we all use this, and this is how we protect our lands and our culture and our way of life. And whereas in Zandra it's pretty different. Zandra is more cultural melting potty. It was assembled, I should be writing this down, but I'm not. Doesn't matter. You know, it used to be many different regions that were all united, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not so peacefully, into this one nation. And so what the government wants, they want a very strong sense of like Zon nationalism, but it's not really the case. Big cultural hub, Seoul is the biggest city in the world. There, magic is just viewed quite differently. It's not accessible to everyone. I think I should add here is kind of like the rules of magic, because that's pretty important. When it comes to equating, we have some rules. So natural forces are stronger than forces of magic. So the way this magic works is you can basically use an Equipass or an Elysium to essentially affect someone else's life forces. You cannot just stop natural death. If someone gets stabbed and they're bleeding to death, you can't save them with an Equipass. You can't heal that wound, right? That's a natural force of death. You can't stop it. But you can kill someone with an Equipass if they're just out living their life, but you can't save someone who's already gonna die. Kind of the other rule of an Equipass is to use an Equipass on someone. You must either be making direct eye contact, or they have to be currently in your eye line, like you have to be able to see them, and you have to have touched them at some point. This, I think, is a really small distinction that has huge cultural ripple effects. The Zon culture isn't touchy. They're not an affectionate culture. They're quite formal, Physical affection is reserved for like close family members, very close friends. You don't just hug people, you don't shake a stranger's hand, that doesn't happen. You date one person very briefly and then you marry them. Bumping into someone in a crowd is like considered a huge social faux pas. Even in a busy crowded street, because Seoul is a very busy city, they have like busy markets and stuff, there's a lot of trade there, so the streets are really busy, but even in these very busy streets, no one is touching, no one bumps into each other. That shows in how they date. You're not going to date a bunch of people if that allows someone to potentially kill you in the future. By most people, they just date one person and then they marry them like 3 months later. The only exception to that would be if you feel you are very powerful. You know, one of the protagonists of this book, he's a bit slutty. He's a very dangerous person. He's a very skilled equator. So to him, it's not really a risk. He has the ability. But, you know, as a result, that's going to create a very monogamous culture, like extremely monogamous culture. You know, it's the opposite in this other realm, like Philha. They don't have any kind of magic there. One of the characters who's from Philha, I don't think she would even understand what a monogamous relationship is. I think if you tried to explain it to her, she'd be like, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? That makes no sense. In Jinsari, we kind of have, again, the same defining features, but they manifest in such a different culture. In Jinsari, there's a very communal culture, very kind of an everyone's extended family vibe. Elysiums are accessible to basically everyone. Parent makes it for you, and then they give it to you as like a coming of age thing. So basically everyone has access to magic, and so there's this extreme sense of trustfulness almost. One other thing we can kind of add on here that kind of connects the two defining features. So Equipasses / Elysiums, they have to be forged in a Sosun. So it's very connected to even to the religion, because the device that you use to do magic is forged in literally the holiest thing in the world, in the body of your god. Knowing that in Zanja, they have this very religious association with magic because of how the devices are forged. And they also know that in Jinsari, people can do this magic, but their Sosun is a secret. In Zanja, people kind of view the Jin form of equating and like use of an Elysium as basically like a bastardized version of the ability, because they're not using an Equipass forward for like the holy Sosun. Even though they literally are though. Equators, one interesting thing I like to think of when you have magic is how does that create jobs that maybe wouldn't exist in our world. So for example, making Equipasses is a job. So I'll cut myself off here, even though like obviously this could go on and on and on and on, right? It could never end. The final thing I wanted to touch on is what do you do when you don't have defining features? This was me with Philha. I've been talking a lot about Zanja and Jinsari in this video. I haven't really touched on Ashar. To be honest, I haven't done much world building for Ashar because the story doesn't really go there. Philha is a prime example of, well, not what to do when you have no defining features, but I really struggled with it for a long time. And I didn't know why I was struggling with it, and now I know the reason I really struggled to do the world building for Philha is because it doesn't have a defining feature. In Zanja, it was really easy for me to develop what I felt like was a very original culture. I didn't want any of the places to feel like just the fantasy versions of real places, right? That was my vision. And I felt like in Zanja and Jinsari, that was easy, and I felt like I achieved that. To me, those places, they don't feel like real places. I looked at very hot desert climates for Zanja in terms of like practicality, but I think the culture, the religion, a lot of aspects of the culture I felt evolved in a very original feeling way because it had these defining features whose ripple effects could kind of permeate throughout all of the world building, and sometimes in very small ways. Philha doesn't have any defining features, and I really struggled to world build Philha. For a long time, I was bored by it, and I felt like I had this really rich culture developing in Zanja and then later on in Jinsari, and Philha was just boring. I used to, as a joke, call Philha Fantasyland, because to me it just felt like a generic medieval Europe fantasy world with like a dash of Viking, and even then barely. It's just because it has like a Nordic sounding name. I really struggled to develop it in an original way because there were no defining features. There weren't these disruptive factors that I could explore the ripple effects. I realized that the way to work around that, if you don't have a magical defining feature, you're going to want cultural defining features. So I have a realm in my fantasy book that I'm currently planning, not this one, where the magic is subtler, it's more lived in, and I have a lot of different realms, and I was working on defining the culture for this one place, and so I gave them a cultural defining feature. Their culture greatly revolves around falconry. They bond with the falcon, and it's very important. It permeates through so many aspects of their culture. And so if you don't have a magical defining feature, or if your magical defining features are more widespread, like they apply to every realm in your world, but you still want to have like distinct cultures, I think the way to make the cultures distinct is then to think of the cultural defining features. and add those disruptors that might be different from what we have on Earth. Now, personally, that's the type of world building I enjoy, is world building that feels like it's not based on just a real Earth, time, and place. Nothing wrong with that. I think it's because I'm not a historian, and so for me, it's easier to build something from scratch than to base it on a real Earth, time, and place, because I'm not a historian, so I don't really have the knowledge to do that. So for me, this is a really ideal way of world building compared to maybe someone who has like a lot of knowledge about the time period they're using as inspiration, who might be able to do more of a historically accurate style of world building where then you weave in some magical elements. For me, I like to start from those disruptive elements and work out, because I'm not a historian, I don't have that background knowledge, and so it's actually easier for me to start from scratch and to create more of a ground up world building where you're kind of building the culture more from scratch, and I like the result of that for my own work to end up with something that feels more unique. It's why I was so underwhelmed with Philha, and still am kind of underwhelmed with Philha, because it just feels kind of dull. That is my whole example. I hope that this was interesting. I don't know, I could have gone on and on and on forever, because obviously I have 7 years of world building to draw from, but I hope that this general example kind of gives an example of weaving outwards from your defining features by just asking yourself how that would affect different aspects of the world and how those things intertwine, and like asking yourself questions and seeing how you can link things together through the solution. That's kind of the mindset I like to take when I'm world building. It really works for me, and I find it's really helpful for the type of worlds that I usually like to create, which, like I said, is something that has more of a built from the ground up feel rather than a this is inspired by this time and place. Not that I have like the most ground up world building ever, there certainly are still like conventions taken from our world, but I think this method has worked really well for me for that style of world building, which is what I generally like. So that's all for this video. I'm excited to do more videos on world building in the future. Eventually, I hope to do one on like a tour of my world building Bible. My question for this video is, if you're writing fantasy, I would love to know what you think the defining feature or defining features of your world are, and how has this created interesting little connections or unexpected little connections. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope in the future I'll have more videos on world building as I learn more. I am still new to this area of writing. Well, not really new, because I started writing fantasy so long ago. Still learning so much. So I'm excited to kind of go along that journey of learning more about world building and sharing what I learn about it with you guys as I go. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.